Picture this. It's early morning, somewhere in ancient Central Europe, around 30,000 years ago, and a red deer is doing what red deer do at this particular watering hole at this particular time of day, which is to say exactly what it has done every single morning for the last several years without incident. The path to the water is the same path. The gap in the reeds is the same gap. The footing near the bank is the same reliable footing it's always been. Everything about this morning is identical to every other morning, which is precisely the problem, because 3 days ago, while the deer was somewhere else entirely, a group of ancient humans spent several hours very carefully making this morning's identical routine into a fundamentally different situation than every previous morning without changing a single obvious thing about how it looked or smelled from the deer's perspective. The deer steps into the gap in the reeds. Something tightens around its leg with shocking speed. It lurches forward. The footing it's relied on for years gives way into a concealed pit that didn't exist yesterday. And somewhere nearby, patient and quiet and already moving, are the people who understood that the most powerful tool available for hunting an animal that's faster, stronger, and more sensorially capable than you are isn't a better weapon. It's a better understanding of the animal's own behavior, used against it with a precision that the animal has absolutely no cognitive framework for defending against. So here's the question this entire video exists to dig into, because it's one of the most fascinating asymmetries in all of ancient human survival. Why couldn't animals avoid ancient human traps? Animals that can outrun, outfight, outsmell, and outmaneuver any individual ancient human consistently, repeatedly, often fatally fell into traps set by those same ancient humans. Why? Stick around, because the answer reaches deep into animal cognition, evolutionary biology, and some genuinely impressive ancient human behavioral understanding. And by the end of this, you might look at your own habit-driven daily routines with a slightly different, slightly more unsettled kind of awareness. Let's start with the most fundamental, most important concept underlying this entire story, because it explains almost everything else. Ancient human trap technology wasn't primarily a weapons technology. It was a behavioral prediction technology. A trap doesn't work because it's physically stronger than the animal it catches. It works because the trap's designer accurately predicted exactly where the animal would be, exactly when, doing exactly what, and positioned the trap to intercept that predicted behavior at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability. The weapon does essentially nothing until the animal's own behavioral predictability delivers it to the exactly right location at the exactly right time. This reframing immediately shifts the entire question of why animals couldn't avoid ancient human traps from how were the traps physically superior to why couldn't animals disrupt the behavioral predictability that made those traps work? And that version of the question turns out to have a genuinely fascinating, deeply important answer rooted in one of the most fundamental asymmetries between human and animal cognition in the entire story of ancient human ecological dominance. Animals are extraordinarily, often brilliantly adapted to the threats their evolutionary history prepared them for. A deer has exceptional threat detection for predators that hunt by direct pursuit, extraordinary peripheral vision for detecting movement in its field of view, explosive acceleration for rapid escape from immediate threat, and powerful pattern recognition for identifying disturbance in familiar environments. Everything about a deer's survival toolkit is exquisitely calibrated for exactly the kinds of threats deer have faced across millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Threats that announce themselves through movement, scent, sound, and direct approach. What a deer's evolutionary toolkit is almost entirely unprepared for is a threat that presents none of those signals. A danger that lies completely still, produces no scent profile distinguishable from the surrounding environment, makes no sound, and doesn't approach the animal at all because it doesn't need to. This is the core of why ancient human traps were so devastatingly effective. Against animals that were in every direct physical sense superior to the humans who set them. Ancient trap technology exploited a genuine gap in animal threat detection systems, a gap that evolution hadn't closed because no natural threat in the animal's evolutionary history had ever required it to close. Camouflage, scent masking, patient stillness, these were the specific capabilities that exploited the animal's evolutionary blind spot. And ancient human intelligence was uniquely positioned to understand and deliberately exploit exactly that blind spot in ways no other predator in the animal's environment ever had. Let's talk about habit and behavioral predictability specifically, because this is the single most important exploitable characteristic that made ancient trap technology so consistently effective across so many different animal species in so many different environments. Animals, including highly intelligent ones, rely on habit and behavioral routine to an extraordinary degree, and for genuinely good evolutionary reasons. Forming reliable behavioral habits around successful, tested routines, using the same water source that has proved safe, traveling the same path that has never produced a threat, resting in the same location that has never been disturbed, represents an enormously efficient survival strategy that minimizes the cognitive effort required for everyday navigation of a familiar environment. Habit works beautifully as a survival strategy in a world where the most significant threats are other animals operating on instinct and direct sensory response, because none of those other animals have the cognitive architecture to study the behavioral habit, understand it as a pattern, and deliberately exploit that pattern through preparation that happens before the moment of threat. A lion can't lay a trap. A hyena can't disguise a pit in a familiar water path. A crocodile can't selectively modify the scent profile of a route to eliminate its own presence while leaving all other environmental cues intact. These animals are, in various ways, impressive predators, but they're all operating on fundamentally reactive, present-moment threat delivery systems. The animal's habit-driven routines are completely safe from them because no animal predator has the cognitive capacity to exploit habit rather than simply responding to it. Ancient humans did. This is the specific, crucial cognitive asymmetry that made ancient trap technology so effective. Ancient humans could observe an animal's behavioral pattern across multiple days or even weeks, identify specific predictable behaviors in specific predictable locations at specific predictable times, understand those patterns as exploitable vulnerabilities rather than simply observing them as interesting animal behavior, and then prepare a response that would be delivered not by human presence but by the environment itself, modified in ways that exploited the animal's own behavioral predictability. The animal's habit, its greatest survival asset in a world of reactive predators, became its most catastrophic vulnerability the moment a cognitively sophisticated, deliberate, planning-capable human started paying attention to it. Let's talk about scent masking and olfactory deception specifically, because this addresses one of the most powerful animal threat detection systems and represents one of the most impressive aspects of ancient human trap setting skill. Most mammals, and certainly most prey animals relevant to ancient human hunting, have olfactory detection capabilities that dramatically exceed human sensing. A deer can detect human scent from distances and in concentrations that would be completely imperceptible to any human nose. In a world where trap technology requires some degree of human physical presence at or near the trap location during setup, this creates an obvious, potentially fatal problem. Even a perfectly camouflaged trap physically indistinguishable from natural surroundings will be detected and avoided if it carries detectable human scent. Ancient trappers almost certainly developed elaborate scent management protocols through exactly the kind of trial and error, multi-generational knowledge accumulation we've documented throughout this series for every other ancient human practical skill, covering fresh human scent with materials from the natural environment using local soil, plant material, urine from the target species itself, or other locally available olfactory masking agents that blended the trap's scent profile back into the expected environmental background, allowing sufficient time after trap setup for the acute human scent to diminish to background levels before the expected target arrived. Approaching and departing trap locations from downwind directions to minimize scent deposition in the critical approach zone an animal would traverse before reaching the trap. These protocols weren't written down. They were transmitted orally across generations through exactly the kind of evening fire storytelling and demonstration culture we've discussed throughout this series, accumulated across many generations of failed trap sets where an obviously disturbed animal had detected the setup and avoided it, gradually refining into sophisticated, specific, situationally adapted scent management knowledge that addressed one of the most powerful animal threat detection systems with deliberate, thoughtful countermeasures. Let's talk about pit traps specifically, because these represent one of the most ancient, most geographically widespread, and most mechanically straightforward forms of animal trap, with genuinely good archaeological documentation across multiple ancient sites. A pit trap exploits a fundamental vulnerability that no amount of superior speed, strength, or sensory capability can protect against once the animal has committed to its routine trajectory, gravity. A pit dug deep enough and concealed effectively enough converts an animal's routine movement into a fatal descent without requiring any human to be present, to outrun the animal, or to overcome its defensive capabilities in any direct confrontation. The effective concealment of a pit trap requires exactly the kind of behavioral observation we discussed, knowing where specifically to dig so that the animal's predictable movement path crosses directly over the concealed pit, knowing how to cover the pit in ways that visually match the surrounding terrain well enough to pass the animal's examination, and knowing how to manage the scent profile of freshly turned soil, which produces a distinctive smell that many prey animals respond to as a potential disturbance signal. All of these requirements demand detailed, species-specific, location-specific knowledge that only accumulated observation and transmitted experience could provide. Ancient pit traps found at various excavated sites show dimensions and configurations that researchers have interpreted as specifically targeted at particular prey species, with depth and width calibrated to the specific size and movement of the intended target rather than representing one-size-fits-all construction. This species-specific optimization, building trap dimensions to match the specific animal rather than building generically, represents genuine practical engineering knowledge accumulated through experience with what worked and what didn't for specific target species in specific terrain types, and transmitted forward as specific practical guidance for trappers working in similar conditions. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's address snare technology here, because snares represent a different category of trap mechanics from pit traps and exploit different aspects of animal behavioral predictability in genuinely clever ways. A snare is essentially a noose positioned in an animal's regular travel path or constructed at an opening the animal reliably passes through, designed to tighten around the animal's leg, neck, or body as it moves forward, converting the animal's own forward momentum into the force that secures the capture. This is mechanically elegant in a way that's worth appreciating directly. The trap requires no external force from any human. The animal itself provides all the mechanical energy required to complete the capture, and the faster and more forcefully the animal attempts to escape once caught, the more effectively the snare typically tightens. Snares work specifically because animals generally respond to unexpected constraint by accelerating forward movement rather than backing up. An instinctive response perfectly appropriate for escaping most natural threats, which create constraint through direct physical grasping that additional forward movement typically does release, but perfectly counterproductive when the constraining mechanism is a noose that tightens with exactly that additional forward force. Evolution hadn't prepared prey animals for a constraint that responded to escape attempts by becoming more effective, because no natural predator in their evolutionary environment created that specific mechanical situation. The materials ancient humans used for snare construction represent another impressive application of accumulated natural material knowledge using sinew, plant fiber cordage, raw hide, and various other natural materials processed to provide the specific combination of tensile strength, flexibility, and appropriate working diameter required for effective snare function with different target species. Larger, stronger animals required heavier gauge cordage and more robust anchor systems. Smaller animals required finer, less visually detectable material that would pass the animal's examination without producing enough visual disturbance to trigger avoidance. These material specifications were almost certainly accumulated through extensive practical experience, refined across generations of trap makers who observed what worked and what failed for specific target species in specific contexts. Let's talk about something genuinely fascinating regarding the cognitive gap between ancient human trap designers and the animals they were trapping, because this asymmetry deserves direct, specific attention rather than being left as simply implied throughout this discussion. The gap isn't primarily about raw intelligence in some general sense. Many of the animals ancient humans were trapping are, by any reasonable standard, cognitively impressive creatures. Deer demonstrate excellent environmental memory and genuine associative learning. Wolves and wild boar show sophisticated social intelligence. Even prey animals typically considered less cognitively impressive show genuine adaptive learning capability that makes them difficult to catch using simple, repetitive methods. The specific cognitive capability that ancient trap designers possessed and animal trap victims didn't isn't general intelligence, but a very particular combination of capabilities. The ability to understand another animal's behavior as a pattern, to model that pattern abstractly enough to predict its future expression in specific circumstances, and to intervene in the environment in advance of that predicted future moment to create conditions that would exploit the predicted behavior before the behavior actually occurred. This is future-oriented behavioral modeling combined with preemptive environmental modification, something that requires genuinely sophisticated abstract thinking about cause, effect, and temporal sequence in ways that appear to be, based on everything cognitive science research has established, uniquely or near uniquely human in its full, deliberate, multi-step expression. An animal can learn that a specific location is dangerous after experiencing a threat there. That's associative learning, genuinely useful, broadly distributed across many species. What an animal cannot do is understand that a location currently showing no threat signs will contain a threat in the future because a cognitively sophisticated entity has modified it in undetectable ways to create a future threat. That specific prediction failure is precisely what ancient traps exploited. And no amount of sensory superiority, speed, strength, or reactive intelligence can close a gap that exists at the level of abstract future modeling rather than at the level of present moment threat detection. Let's address something genuinely interesting regarding how animals did eventually learn to be warier in environments with dense ancient human presence, because this adds an important nuance to the story. While animals couldn't avoid traps in the specific cognitive sense we've been discussing, various prey animal populations in regions of sustained ancient human hunting pressure did show measurable behavioral changes over time, generally characterized by increased overall wariness toward anything associated with human presence, wider flight distance responses to detected human scent, and greater avoidance of areas with frequent human activity. These behavioral adaptations represent exactly the kind of associative learning that animals are genuinely capable of. Learning that certain environmental signals, human scent, visual presence of humans, certain types of environmental disturbance correlate with danger and should trigger avoidance. Ancient trappers almost certainly observed and responded to these learned avoidance behaviors, continuously refining their scent management, camouflage, and approach protocols to stay ahead of the prey animal's learned wariness. This created a genuine, ongoing dynamic between trapper knowledge and prey animal learning, with ancient hunters continuously improving their deception techniques in response to prey, animals getting smarter about their general environment association with danger, while prey animals could never quite close the specific cognitive gap that prevented them from understanding the mechanism of the trap itself, rather than simply learning to associate certain ambient environmental signals with past danger. Let's bring in something genuinely fascinating here regarding the specific role of trap technology in enabling ancient human groups to hunt more efficiently, because this connects to broader themes we've discussed throughout this series regarding ancient resource management and daily life. Active hunting, the kind requiring direct human pursuit and weapon delivery we discussed in our megafauna hunting video, is energetically expensive, physically dangerous, and success uncertain in ways that make it a genuinely high-risk, high-reward food acquisition strategy. Trap hunting represents a fundamentally different resource acquisition model, one that front-loads the cognitive and physical effort into setup and allows the actual food acquisition to happen passively, without human presence, potentially at multiple locations simultaneously. A group of ancient humans with a dozen snares set along reliable animal travel corridors could be simultaneously hunting in a dozen locations overnight while sleeping, allowing the trap technology to work entirely on its own while the hunters recovered physically, engaged in other essential camp tasks, or traveled to other hunting and foraging areas. This passive, distributed, parallel hunting capability almost certainly represented a significant improvement in overall group food acquisition efficiency compared to exclusive reliance on active hunting and the accumulated knowledge required to deploy it effectively, where specifically to set traps for different species, how to conceal them effectively, how to maintain them across multiple days, represented genuine, valuable intellectual capital that experienced trappers within a group would have held and transmitted carefully. Let's also address the psychological dimension of trap hunting from the human side, because it's genuinely interesting and connects to the broader story of ancient human cognition we've been building throughout this entire series. Successfully setting a trap requires a specific kind of imaginative projection, mentally placing yourself in the animal's position, imagining its sensory experience of the modified environment you've created, and asking whether that imagined sensory experience would produce the behavioral response the trap depends on to work. This is perspective taking in a genuine, sophisticated sense, using your own cognitive modeling of another being's sensory and behavioral experience to predict and manipulate that behavior in advance. It's cognitively demanding, requires genuine imaginative flexibility, and produces better outcomes the more accurately the trapper can model the target animal's actual sensory experience, rather than simply projecting human sensory experience onto the animal's behavior. The best ancient trappers were almost certainly those who could most accurately imagine the animal's perspective, understanding specifically what the modified environment would look like, smell like, and feel like to an animal with that specific species' particular sensory capabilities and behavioral tendencies, rather than viewing the modified environment through purely human sensory experience. This specific cognitive capability, accurate cross-species perspective taking in the service of behavioral prediction, is one of the most distinctively sophisticated applications of theory of mind anywhere in the ancient human behavioral record. Let's circle back to our red deer from the opening scenario, stepping into the gap in the reeds on a morning identical in every apparent way to every previous morning, finding in the last moment before the snare tightens that the world it understood perfectly well for years has been quietly, invisibly, and completely incomprehensibly modified by minds that understood it even better. Based on everything we've covered here, that deer's failure to avoid the trap wasn't a failure of perception, speed, or even learned wariness about known danger signals. It was a failure of a cognitive capability the deer simply doesn't have, the ability to understand that a currently threat-free environment has been modified in advance by a deliberately planning entity to create a future threat that hasn't yet manifested in any currently detectable way. So why couldn't animals avoid ancient human traps? Based on the fundamental exploitation of habit and behavioral predictability as vulnerabilities rather than assets, the specific cognitive asymmetry between ancient human future-oriented behavioral modeling and animal present-moment threat detection, the deliberate scent masking and environmental camouflage that neutralized animals' most powerful threat detection systems, the mechanical elegance of designs that used the animal's own behavioral responses against it, the passive multi-location hunting efficiency that trap technology enabled, and the multi-generational accumulation and transmission of highly specific practical knowledge about individual species' behavioral vulnerabilities and detection thresholds. The honest answer is that animals couldn't avoid ancient human traps because their entire evolutionary threat detection toolkit had been developed against a completely different category of threat, one that operated reactively in the present moment rather than proactively in future modeled time. Ancient trap technology wasn't superior to the animal's defenses. It operated in a dimension those defenses simply didn't cover, in the gap between what the animal's brilliant, evolutionarily refined present-moment threat detection could perceive and what an abstract, future-oriented, behaviorally modeling human mind could quietly, patiently, invisibly arrange. And that gap, invisible to the animal, was everything.